Hello and welcome to this spotlight episode on the Ballarat, the illegitimate Australian cousin of the Talyllyn Railway's Dolgoch. 70 years ago, on the 14th of May 1951, the Talyllyn Railway in North Wales made history as being the first railway to be preserved. The line had been built in the 1860s by the McConnell family of Manchester to transport slate from Curragh at Bryn Glis down to the sea at Talyllyn. Amazingly, 90 years later, it still possessed both its original locomotives, Dolgoch and Talyllyn, and its original carriages. Success of the narrow gauge line during that first hopeful summer of preservation depended entirely on their only working locomotive, Dolgoch. But what has this got to do with Ballarat, a locomotive built thousands of miles away from North Wales and from Whitehaven in Cumbria, where Dolgoch was built? Well, it's because Ballarat, built in 1871 in Ballarat, is essentially an Australian-built copy, or perhaps cousin, of Fletcher Jennings' patent locomotive. Ballarat was the second locomotive to be built in what became the city of Ballarat, one of the major Australian railway centres, in 1871 at the Victoria Foundry. She was designed by Mr. Jonathan Robinson, the foreman of the Victoria Foundry, and the work was executed under the superintendence of Mr. W. Watson, the inspecting engineer of the West Australian Timber Company, who had ordered the locomotive. Many of the components of Ballarat were imported from Britain. The boiler was made from wrought iron plates sourced from the Low Moor Foundry near Bradford in Yorkshire, England, and it was made by a local boiler maker, Mr. Hickman of Mare Street of Ballarat. The brass boiler tubes, the wheels, axles and springs were all imported from Britain, and judging by the cylinder castings, either Robinson copied Fletcher Jennings' design exactly, or these two were imported, making Ballarat an even closer cousin of Dolgoch, given that she's probably running on wheels and axles, and perhaps even using cylinders made by Fletcher Jennings of Whitehaven, and with a boiler made from Yorkshire iron plate. Furthermore, the design of Ballarat is virtually identical to that of Dolgoch, albeit scaled up to suit a gauge of 3 feet 6 inches. But this may not be surprising, given that Fletcher Jennings promoted their patent designs in the technical press of the day, and indeed it is likely that the technical information and engravings thus published provided the basis for the designs of Ballarat. One now debunked theory about Ballarat's design is that she was built by William Bowstead, who had been a fitter at Fletcher Jennings of Whitehaven, and had been the first driver and loco foreman on the Talyllyn Railway. The link being, of course, that he emigrated to Australia. However, given that Bowstead didn't emigrate until 1884, and that Ballarat was built in 1871, this doesn't really hold together. The cast iron wheels are 3 feet in diameter and cast to a very, very similar pattern to those on Dolgoch. The cast iron cylinders measure 7 inches by 14 inches, and the slide valves have very long tail rods, again very, very similar to other Fletcher Jennings designs. Cut-off was 75%, and the valves were worked again using a Fletcher Jennings design, this time Fletcher Jennings' peculiar patent valve gear. Because Ballarat and Dolgoch's driven axle is placed behind the firebox, this means that the eccentrics have to be placed on the leading or coupled axle, and this will lead to very lumpy valve timing indeed. This of course means that the eccentric rods at first run back towards the firebox. There they meet the curved gauge expansion link and a second pair of rods, which include a U-shaped curve in order to clear the leading axle, then provides motion to the slide valves. It's an absolute maintenance nightmare, as many drivers and fitters of Dolgoch can attest. Water, as with Dolgoch, is carried in a 200-gallon well tank under the footplate, and there was sufficient bunker space for 1 ton of timber. In working order, she weighed 10 imperial tons, and thanks to a high boiler pressure of 150 psi, could generate a tracting effort of 2,330 pounds at the railhead, being able to haul on the level 150 tons at a speed of 10 miles per hour. The completion and testing of Ballaarat was proudly announced by the Ballarat Star newspaper on the 15th of March 1871, where she won very fulsome praise. She was painted dark green and cost the princely sum of £800 sterling. She was delivered by sea from Melbourne in August 1871 to the West Australian Timber Company, where she operated on their 3-foot 6-inch gauge railway. The track was in fact made from timber, with straps of steel nailed on top, and here she worked, hauling timber trains until 1888, when the West Australian Timber Company went bust. By this point, the network of railways operated by the West Australian Timber Company had reached a length of 30 kilometres, and a homemade tender was provided for Ballarat to increase water and fuel capacity. She briefly returned to service between 1893 and 1895, but thereafter Ballarat was stored out of use in a shed at Lockville. Sadly, in 1900 this shed caught fire and burned down, severely damaging the engine. The wooden cab was burned, so too the boiler cladding and the wooden buffer beam, as well as the wooden frame of the tender. And here Ballarat would remain, a forlorn hulk, for many years. Her tender, however, was salvaged and reused behind another locomotive, the Snorting Liz, at the Wilga Timber Mill in 1922. Sadly, when the mill closed in 1984, the tender was sold for scrap. A campaign was begun as early as 1901 to see Ballarat preserved, being first offered to the West Australian Museum and Art Gallery, but these discussions were curtailed by the First World War. It was until 1929 that she was recovered, repaired and used in a street parade for the centenary celebrations in Perth. She would remain in Perth until 1934, when she was moved to Busselton, near to where Ballarat first ran in 1871, and was put on public display in 1937 out in the open in the centre of Victoria Square, a popular and much loved piece of local history. However, 75 years of outside display took their toll on the little engine, and finally, in 2012, work began on a complete, sympathetic restoration, which saw her take pride of place in the Ballarat room in the old City Railway Station at Busselton in 2017. Whilst not as old as her English, or should that be Welsh cousin Dolgoch, Ballarat is 150 years old this year. As such, she's the oldest Australian-built locomotive to exist, and the first 3-foot 6-inch gauge locomotive to be built in Australia, thus earning her an important place in Australian railway history. Now, wouldn't it be nice to see these cousins meet face to face for the first time? I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, please show your appreciation by liking, sharing and subscribing. If you would like to get early access to this channel's content, perhaps you would like to support Rail Story on Patreon for the cost of a takeout cup of coffee once per month. And I look forward to seeing you all next time on Rail Story.